Welcome to our Master Gardener presentation, Bringing Native Plants into Your Garden. This is part 1, Why and How to Garden with Natives. Please come to part 2 next Saturday on locally native plants in your garden. I'm Chrissy Freeman. I started as a Master Gardener in 2017. I've been gardening since I graduated from college. And I discovered native plants when we moved to Nevada County in 2006. I have my understanding of native plants and their roles in the ecosystem and in the landscape has evolved over that time, in large part thanks to the Redbud chapter of the California Native Plant Society and the people in that chapter. Darlene?
I'm Darlene Ward, and I became a Master Gardener in 2011. I always loved wildflowers as a child, and I finally took some classes on native plants at the community college in San Diego in the 1990s. When we moved to Nevada County in 2006, I was determined to have a native plant garden, and I do. Rita?
Hi, I'm Rita Quaid. My husband Bob and I received our Master Gardener training in 2019, the most recent class. We've been gardening for many decades and have become increasingly interested in native plants over the last few years, especially since moving to the foothills in 2017.
We're going to start by talking about what we're going to cover today. First, we'll talk about why use native plants. What are the benefits to ourselves and the ecosystem? Then we'll talk about the importance of knowing your site before you start and what you should know. Next, we'll cover basic landscape design concepts, which are the same for native plant gardening as for other gardening, but we want to make sure that these are part of your understanding. Then we'll talk about how to select the right native plants. Right plant, right place is a basic concept that Master Gardeners has worked on and shared with people for many, many years. Then we will look at native plants that do well in gardens, and we'll focus on native plants for pollinators. Finally, we'll take a look at some native plant gardens.
So let's talk about why you might consider adding native plants to your garden. Native plants have many benefits for our environment and local wildlife, as well as for us as gardeners. Native plants tend to be drought tolerant and generally don't require fertilizer or pesticides that can be harmful to the environment. Our local critters have evolved to live in harmony with the native plants that provide food, shelter, nesting material, and breeding sites. Of course, deer will eat just about anything you might have in your garden, but are less interested in native plants as compared to soft, tasty non-natives. And natives don't require a lot of pruning or maintenance. This gives the gardener a little more leisure time to enjoy the beauty and balance of nature that surrounds them. Okay, so let's talk about why you might consider adding native plants to your garden. Next. Native plants have many benefits for our environment and local wildlife, as well as for us as gardeners. Native plants tend to be drought tolerant and generally don't require fertilizer or pesticides that can be harmful to the environment. Our local critters have evolved to live in harmony with the native plants that provide food, shelter, nesting material, and breeding sites. Of course, deer will eat just about anything you might have in your garden, but are less interested in native plants as compared to soft, tasty non-natives. And they don't require a lot of pruning or maintenance. This gives the gardener a little more leisure time to enjoy the beauty and balance of nature that surrounds them. Next. So I'd like to share a brief personal story. While living in Sacramento, my husband and I had a lush garden packed into a small suburban lot. While we were frequent shoppers at the plant sales at the UC Davis Arboretum and had lots of Mediterranean-friendly plants, we really had only a few local native specimens in our yard. Next. In 2017, we moved to South Nevada County, and this is what our new yard looked like. An oak woodland property that had very little landscaping, but gave us the opportunity to recreate a more natural ecosystem with habitat that would help to support local wildlife. Next. We opted to hire a local landscaping company to do all the hard work, including building a pond that thirsty critters enjoy year-round. And they planted dozens of plants, a mix of natives and non-native specimens. And we learned the hard way that many non-natives just don't thrive in our dry, rocky hilltop. So we're in the process of gradually transitioning to more natives. Chrissy and Darlene will now talk about what you can do to avoid making some of the mistakes that we made. Chrissy?
It's important to know your site before you start any landscape endeavor. You want to review the existing plants in the area of your upcoming project. Like, which ones do you like? What kind of water and care do those plants need? And for instance, in this conversion of lawn to landscape that you see here, the owners decided they wanted to keep the native redwood on the right and the western sword ferns that were in the front of the yard. Soil. Know your soil. It's important because soil ranges from clay to loamy to sandy. Much of the soil in our area has a high clay content, but there's plenty of variability. So test how well your soil drains. There's the jar and dish soap test, and that's detailed online. So if you just put jar and dish soap test in your browser, you'll find out how to do it. And so is a percolation test, which is basically digging a hole and seeing how long it drains, if it drains within an hour. Your plant should match the soil type because plants have a certain tolerance for how quickly or slowly water drains from around their roots. Become familiar with the patterns of light in the area you're going to be landscaping with natives. Know which way is south and west, so you'll know where the strongest and sunlight and longest sunlight comes from. Plants love eastern light, you know that, so observe the sunny and shady areas throughout the day and across the seasons. Doesn't mean you can't do anything until you've been there for a whole year, but extrapolate and know, if you know the directions, you can extrapolate. So then microclimates. Microclimates is a way of understanding that different areas on your property have different small little aspects of climate. Lower areas are cooler because cool air sinks, warmer air rises. Certain, like the sunny side, as we talked about, those are sunnier and hotter. Some areas are moist and dry. Some are more frozen, and that will tell you, oh, it's moisture there. And again, observe over the course of the year. So keep track of these things. And that'll give you an opportunity to plant different kinds of plants in different areas, perhaps. And maybe you're fortunate and have a natural water source on your property. If you do, take advantage of having this riparian area and use their plants that would naturally grow there. So this site, like a year-round stream, a pond, a bog, some kind of drainage, it allows for some plantings that, you know, would do well there. And look for any place that water-loving native plants naturally grow, even if there's no surface water. That's a place where you can grow more water-loving plants.
So now we're ready to think about landscape design. Some people ask, How can I use native plants in my garden? Well, the answer is the same way as any other plants. There is a California native plant that can fit in any role in your garden, from ground cover to trees. You can design your landscape yourself in whatever way that is pleasing to you, because it's your garden. The references in our handout will help you do it yourself. If you turn to a landscape designer, be sure it is someone who knows native plants. So where do you start? Start with your inspiration. Forget trying to duplicate the garden you had somewhere else, because gardening in the foothills is different from valley, coastal, or desert gardening. Think about what size garden you want. Just a few native plants? Are you going to do a complete makeover? Maybe you have a brand new garden with nothing there yet. Think about how will you use your space. Do you want a place to socialize, to cook, to meditate, for children's play? Do you share your yard with your dog? Do you want a formal look or an informal look? It can be either with native plants. Do you want to emphasize flowers or foliage? You can do both. What colors do you prefer? And are there any problems that you want to solve? Do you want to screen or accent views, stabilize banks and slopes, maybe prevent erosion, provide defensible space, heal the land, or attract wildlife? The next thing to think about is garden flow. How will people move through your garden? Can you reveal the garden in stages? Will you highlight views, create views, and use specimen plants? How about using garden rooms where each one is a little different and you have transitions between them? Provide places for relaxation, including benches or large boulders to sit on. Think of safety, tripping hazards, thorny bushes close to the path, and anything else like bumping their head on an overhanging branch. Now it's time to be practical. How much time do you have? What is your time frame? Is your budget big enough to hire people? And maybe you prefer to do it yourself, but how much can you do? And do you really want to do? Okay, now we're ready to start putting ideas on paper. Ideally, use graph paper. Draw to scale, indicate north. But you know, a rough draft will work too. Sketch your existing space with heavy lines and then use tracing paper or tissue paper on top to draw on. This way you can create multiple versions without erasing, and you can try out lots of different ideas. The second step is you're going to need to sketch in hardscape. That's non-living elements, paths, patios, seating areas, water features, garden art, underground irrigation, all of that, anything that is not living. Then draw in symbols for the existing plants that you'll keep. The third step, now you start sketching in types of plants. Notice the word types, you're not naming specific plants yet. Start with trees, shrubs, then perennials. Try to visualize the area from different viewpoints, and you might color code the plants by type. It works if you plant in groups of 3 or drifts of color, and remember to use repetition of plants. Allow time to change your mind, and while you're waiting and thinking, continue to learn more about native plants. Rita.
Okay, so how do you find out which native plants might work well for your yard? Next. A happy plant is one that is in the right place for its needs. While a pretty plant might catch your attention at the nursery, you want to make sure it will work in your garden. Will the plant eventually outgrow the space you have available for it? Does it have thorns or irritating foliage that will become a problem if placed too close to walkways? How much light and moisture can your yard offer? Are you at an elevation that experiences hard freezes that might kill more tender plants? Which native plants typically grow happily together? Where might you be able to purchase your choices? There are many online resources to help you in your research. Our handout, it's quite extensive. It lists all the sites we'll be talking about and more, so you don't have to scramble to write things down. Next. A great place to start is Calscape's fairly basic but fun garden planner. Just answer 4 simple questions. You enter your city and then the general style of garden that you're interested in. Next is how much sun your planting area gets. Then you indicate your biggest priority in creating a native garden, perhaps a pollinator habitat, or bird watching, or water conservation, or deer resistance. And voila, you are presented with a list of plants that will probably do well for your site. The list has basic descriptions of the plant and what critters besides us are most likely to enjoy that particular plant. Next. Calscape also offers a much more detailed site that allows you to spend potentially many hours browsing through hundreds of California natives. You can click on the map or enter an address to see what grows in an area. When I type in my address, I'm shown a list of 748 plants native to my neighborhood. Next. So let's see what Calscape has to tell us about the Western Redbud. On the left side, you get to feast your eyes on beautiful photos of the plant. On the right is a map showing where you would typically find this plant growing naturally. Next. The site also gives details on the growth characteristics. It will give you information such as the eventual size of the mature plant, when the plant produces its flowers, the colors and fragrance of the flowers, and when the plant goes dormant. You can also find what types of critters are supported by that plant. Next. And the site also provides a nice tidy summary of landscaping details, common uses for the plant, what maintenance is typically required, and how to propagate the plant. The section on companion plants is very informative. It tells you what other plants make good neighbors. We'll be talking more about companion plants and plant communities in part 2 of our presentation next week. Next. Calflora is another site that may be helpful. It can help you learn about plants that grow wild, including native plants as well as weeds. A particularly nice feature is the ability to outline an area on the map and then get a list of what plants have been observed growing naturally in that specific area. Next. An important concept to keep in mind when planning your garden is hydrozones, grouping plants together based on their water requirements. A plant that requires very little water or even no summer water will likely drown and rot if placed among water-guzzling plants that get irrigated daily. Next. If you really want to get nerdy, take a look at WCALS, the Water Use Classification of Landscape Species. It's a great place to check for the water requirements of plants. It allows you to search for the irrigation needs for several thousand plants used in California landscaping. Next. But wait, there are more online resources for information about California natives. Here are some nurseries that have helpful sites. These will be listed on our handout. And next, our own Redbud chapter of the California Native Plant Society is a great source of information. You also might want to check out Circes.org, a site that focuses on protecting habitat for pollinators. And next, if you'd like to see how other folks have created gardens featuring native plants, here are a few places that you might want to visit. Locally, we have our Master Gardener Demo Garden on the NID grounds on Main Street. Dozens of master gardeners have collectively spent thousands of hours creating various habitats. If you're in the mood for a road trip, take a drive down to Davis. The Arboretum is well worth the time. It's also a great place for a picnic and a long stroll among several habitats. And Chrissy will now talk a little about supporting our local pollinators.
Gardening to support our native pollinators has become increasingly popular, as I'm sure most of you are aware. So we're going to look at why this matters and why it's so important to use native plants to support pollinators. So let's start by talking about what are pollinators? What animals are pollinators? So these are the creatures that pollinate the plants, that carry the pollen from one flower to another of the same species. These are butterflies and our native bees, and which includes honeybees, moths, many other species of insects, hummingbirds, and other small birds. So why does it matter that we support the pollinators? Why does it matter to us? Pollinators have critical roles to play in the survival of the world as we know it. They're part of the whole ecological cycle. Many eat smaller creatures, insects, for instance, in large part, and they themselves are food for other larger creatures in the ecological system. Without the pollinators, we would have we would suffer in terms of flowering plants and food crops, because 75% of our flowering plants need the pollinators in order to produce seeds. And a third of our food crops require pollinators. What would we do without them? So why does it matter that we provide native plant habitat for our pollinators? Pollinator populations are dropping significantly in California, which is home to more native plant species than any other state. It's also home to the most native bee species, 1,600 species of native bees, but the honeybee, by the way, is not native. But the native bee populations are declining. Exposure to pesticides, particularly a kind called neonicotinoids, is a major factor associated with bee declines. The largest cause, however, of bee habitat loss is agricultural intensification, but drought, wildfire, and development are also notable factors. So butterflies also need our help. 19% of our country's butterfly species are at risk of extinction. Monarchs are down from, 4.5 million in the 1980s to fewer than 2,000 among the California overwintering monarchs. I mean, this is just tragic. And the US bird population has also declined by 29% since just 1970, a drop of almost 3 billion among adult birds. Habitat loss is the greatest overall driver of bird decline. So we need to help provide more native plant habitat for the pollinators to make up for the habitat loss they're suffering. So to help you support pollinators effectively, let's talk about what the pollinators need and what brings them to where we are for us to enjoy. Bees, for instance, are attracted to flowers in the colors blue, purple, white, and ultraviolet. Some of these are my favorite colors, maybe yours too. And they come to plants for both nectar, which provides their food, and pollen, which they store in the hives for their little larvae to eat. Then what attracts butterflies and moths? Knowing what attracts them allows us to provide a garden habitat they need. Butterflies and moths like 6 or more hours of sun. They like sun from spring to fall because that's when they're active. So what happens in the winter is, in terms of sun, is not important. They need protection from wind, and they need some quiet little puddle, just a little skim of water for drinking. They also need our gardens to have the right kinds of plants. Like bees, they're attracted to plants that have flowers with nectar. They get food from the nectar, as the bees do, and they consume it with their very long tongue. They have certain colors that are bright that they use to locate where that nectar is. That red, yellow, orange, pink, purple. Whoa, what bright colors. And they like to rest securely on the top of flat-topped or clustered blossoms. And then they sip nectar from the tiny flowers that form those shapes. In each species of butterfly or moth has particular plant species on which it lays its eggs, because the larvae caterpillars that hatch from those eggs are evolved to eat the leaves of only one, or at least specific, plant species. So you perhaps know this best as monarchs requiring local species of milkweed, but this applies to many, many species of butterflies and moths. And you can find out which butterflies and moths are attracted to which plants by looking in Calscape, which lists that for many species of plants. So what attracts birds? Depending on its species, an adult bird may get various types of food from a native plant. Some come to drink nectar, some eat berries and seeds, and some come for the insects that are attracted to the plant. But over 95% of all bird species feed insects to their young because they're protein rich and easier than seeds to digest. So we need those insects in our garden. So then, how can we as gardeners support the pollinators? First, by planting the plants that they use as food. Aim for 3 or more plant species that are blooming in each blooming period: early spring, mid to late spring, and summer. Provide both nectar plants and pollen plants, and you can find that out, generally speaking, in Calscape if you do a little bit of work. And by planting host plants for caterpillars, so that the butterflies and moths can lay their eggs there, so the caterpillars can eat the leaves and grow to maturity. How else? Provide the water in some forms that are accessible to pollinators, both birds, which could use deeper water and that they can walk into, and butterflies and moths. And third, provide shelter. The vast majority of California's native bee species are solitary ground nesting bees. So leave some ground bare for them, ground that you don't cover with mulch. I know this was an adjustment for me. And if you need to do some pruning in the fall, in the late fall, try to leave a clippings pile over the winter for the birds to use as shelter and for insects, their food source, to live. Otherwise, leave the pruning until the spring so that the seed-eating birds can enjoy those last seeds while the food supplies are low. And in the summer and the early fall, bumblebees need places to escape from extreme heat. Being denser than other bees, they tend to overheat more easily. So make sure to leave some logs and leaf piles for them to use. And then you get to look at those wonderful bumblebees. So how do we support the pollinators? Let's pack all the information together. First, recent research supports the goal of aiming for mostly natives. Professor Doug Tallamy and his team found that the bird species they studied needed a backyard to have at least 70% natives in order for the birds to successfully raise their young, because otherwise the yard didn't support enough native insects for the birds to feed their babies. Aim for a sunny location and plant a succession of blooms, as we've mentioned, and aim for a large array of the same species of plant so that the pollinators notice the plants. And then aim for aim for at least 10 species. That'll be nice for you as a gardener. I know that. And also diversity of species increases the number of bees and the diversity of bee species. Be good to you and the bees. So finally, look for local natives. The life cycles of our pollinators often synchronize, so they're in the right place at the right time to get the nectar and the pollen of the plants they prefer. So they come here at a time when they expect those flowers to be opened for them. So let's give them to them. And come to our part 2 next Saturday, which will focus on local natives.
Now we're going to show you how lovely California native plants can look in your garden as they offer attraction to pollinators. We'll start with shrubs. Shrubs provide food and shelter. The carpinteria that you see here is also called bush anemone, is a lovely evergreen native shrub found in the Sierra foothills near Fresno. It offers spring pollen for bees. The next one is coffeeberry. It shows that even tiny flowers attract pollinators. Coffeeberry is an evergreen shrub that is nectar rich, and it attracts bees, butterflies, and birds. It has many uses, from background plant to transitional areas to screens. The photo on the right shows our local species. The photo on the left is a cultivar named Eve Case. Excuse me, Eve Case. A cultivar is a plant that has been selected and maybe hybridized for some special feature. I'm going to have to get a drink. I'm sorry. Eve Case is a more compact plant, and it looks fuller than the straight species. Often pollinators will prefer the straight species over cultivars, but humans may prefer the cultivar for the special feature. We'll talk more about cultivars in part 2. The next plant is white-leaf manzanita, one of our local species. But you know, there are many manzanitas found in California. They range in size from ground covers to shrubs, and some of the named cultivars make lovely specimens. Since they all flower in February, they're an important source of nectar for pollinators and for hummingbirds when there may be little else available. And then we'll look at the desert willow. This large shrub, or small deciduous tree, does very well in our area, although it is native to the desert. Note the strong guidelines for pollinators. It provides both pollen and nectar, and people walking by often comment on the showy flowers. Fuchsia flowered gooseberry leaves out with the very first rain in winter, and it usually goes dormant without any summer water. It grows natively in coastal scrub and chaparral in the southern part of our state, but it does very well here in our gardens. It has 3 sharp spines at each node, so plant it where you won't pass too closely. Hummingbirds are attracted to the red tubular flowers, and notice that bird-pollinated flowers usually lack scent. The pink flowering currant is another spring source of nectar for hummingbirds, and it provides shelter and berries for other birds. This one is from the coast ranges, but it is very similar to our mountain pink currant, which you might prefer to plant. Golden currant offers early spring nectar for bees and has berries that attract birds. Notice how the flower differs from the pink currant. Next, we're going to look at a few perennials. Perennials are smaller in size, but they also provide food and shelter. Hummingbirds and bees love sage for its nectar. Quail and goldfinches eat the seeds. Cleveland sage, shown here, is another Southern California native, but it has a heavenly fragrance, drought tolerance, and lovely blue blooms. It may be a special plant that you'll want to include. Cyanothis plants range in size from ground cover to shrubs to small trees. Here we're showing Cyanothis as ground cover. Cyanothis is an excellent source of spring pollen for native bees. Plants that have small leaves are not eaten by deer, but Cyanothis species that have larger leaves are very likely to be eaten by deer. The final perennial we'll show is emerald carpet ground cover. It is a manzanita, and there are many different manzanitas in California also. Manzanita can be a shrub or a ground cover. Emerald carpet is a hybrid readily available in nurseries that loves acidic soil and supplies nectar for bees. So now let's look at another category. Wildflowers excel at attracting pollinators because they include the elements of color, scent, and pollen. Lupin here has many different varieties in California, but they all show one interesting feature. When they have been pollinated, the white on the banner turns magenta or a color close to that. Bees don't see red, so they will bypass the pollinated flower. Columbine is a special flower to feature in your garden. Our native red-flowered columbine is mostly pollinated by hummingbirds with their long, slender bills and their long tongues. Bees might steal the nectar by punching a hole in that spur. Thus, they will fail to pollinate the flower. Hopefully, they'll come back because notice all those stamens dangling down with a richness of pollen. If you plan to plant a meadow, be sure to choose species that grow natively together. Or you may want to do a wide swath of a single species. The best way to grow wildflowers is from seed. You can check out sources in Calscape. You can also put the name of the plant with the word seed in your browser and do a search. Try to use sources closer to our county whenever possible. This will help maintain the genetic stock of our local native wildflowers. And if you're using a seed mix, select one that most closely matches our foothill species of wildflowers. You probably won't be able to find a perfect mix, but try to include as many as you can that are native here. One last category that we'll look at are bulbs, corms, and rhizomes. They have a place in the garden too. This one, Douglas iris, is called Canyon Snow. It is a hybrid, but it's one of the most reliable and spectacular. Irises are pollinated by bumblebees. Douglas iris comes in many colors, and the hybridizers have been very busy, so you will find a category called Pacific Coast Hybrid. The next slide shows that they come in different colors. You often won't find them labeled as to color in the nursery, so you take your chances and you see what color they are when they bloom. Pretty Face also comes from, I guess it's a bulb type anyway. It grows below 8,000 feet, so you've likely seen it blooming along our trails somewhere. Along with blue dix, lupin, and fairy lantern, Pretty Face can be seen on the Buttermilk Bend Trail at Bridgeport. One last word. There may be a time when the flowers are not as prolific as you would like, so perhaps you will want to mix in a few Mediterranean plants. A Mediterranean plant comes from countries that are similar to ours, with a warm to hot, dry summer and cool, wet winters. This includes parts of South Africa, Australia, Chile, and countries bordering the Mediterranean Sea. It might be easier to find Mediterranean plants in local nurseries. Some of our favorites are lavender, rosemary, non-native sages, and thyme. I'd like to add you may want to also plant some special memory plant. We're not saying everything has to be a native plant, but we are saying use a lot of natives and just mix in a few of the others. Rita?
Okay, so you've made your choices and you're ready to start planting. Natives are best planted in autumn or early winter. This allows time for them to develop a healthy root system prior to the stresses of our hot, dry summers. Avoid fertilizer and amendments. The extra nutrients will likely allow more growth, but this overachievement can reduce a plant's natural lifespan, and the exuberant, tender growth is more attractive to bugs and deer. Keep in mind that even drought-tolerant plants start out as little babies that need extra loving care. So water them during dry weather until they grow up a bit and can handle life more or less on their own. Build a moat around the plant to make it easier to water during the summer, but open the berm during the winter to allow drainage of excess rainwater. And a layer of mulch is helpful to keep those roots moist and cool during our hot summers. But keep the mulch 3 inches away from the stem to avoid rotting. Depending on the plant's preferences, mulch might be leaves or straw or wood chips or even rocks and gravel. Okay, back to Darlene.
Well, we'd like to share some of our gardens. Notice the sign, Native Plants Live Here. This is a California Native Plant Society sign that's available if anyone is interested. Our property is a corner lot, and we had several copies made of the plot plan supplied by the builder of the house. It showed the house, the driveway, the leach lines, an existing oak at the edge of the street, and one symbol for the pine trees in the back. I made my notations right on the plan instead of tracing paper because the plot plan was so very big. So we started with a clean slate. There was little vegetation on the property. In the next photo, you can see that the concrete that the contractor left underground had to be broken up, and we scattered it. We built some mounds burying some of the rubble under the soil. We brought in planter mix and some free soil from an excavation nearby. We laid out 4-foot pathways with wooden stakes. And I sowed wildflower seeds over the leach line right at the corner area. The next slide, which you've already had a glimpse of, shows what that area looked like almost 2 years later. The poppies and some of the wildflowers come back every spring, and they have spread into some of the other areas. Here is another view from the other side of the corner. It again shows the bare soil, and the pathways are marked, shrubs are planted, sitting rocks and drains are in place. Note that the small shrubs are widely spaced apart, estimating their mature size. Silk tassel was protected with a cage. I thought the deer might eat it, but the deer didn't bother any of the shrubs. We'll show you the same area the way it looked 4.5 years later. Most of the shrubs get no summer water, although we do set a rainbird on the meadow area once or twice in the summer. I think the native shrubs may get water from the leach line. Their roots probably go out that far. The next view is another property. It's a larger property with a pasture. The master gardener used to mow regularly in early spring. She decided to let it grow and was amazed at what happened. She had native milkweed that bloomed and all kinds of flowers that came up. This included lupin, wild onion, ukao, blue-eyed grass, and wally basket. Rita.
Okay, well, if possible, allow Mother Nature to help you with your garden plan. She sometimes presents a gift of volunteer plants and places them where she wants them. On the left is a coyote bush that unexpectedly appeared in our yard last year. On the right is our seasonal lawn. Every winter, we're fortunate enough to have a large patch of miner's lettuce green up an area of our normally dry backyard. In the foreground is a carpenteria. Darlene spoke about this plant earlier, not quite in bloom yet. After producing a field of little white flowers, the lush plant mass dies back to leave a thick layer of wonderful organic matter that slowly decomposes over the summer and returns nutrients to the soil for even more growth next winter.
This used to be a typical lawn, and then we converted it to native plants, and now it features small trees, shrubs, some boulders, a dry stream bed, flowering perennials, and grasses. And this was one of my first conversions of from lawn to native plants. Here, we converted a 1,200 square foot lawn, and it became a drought tolerant native plant garden featuring boulders and wood chip mulch. And this is more in line with the chaparral type planting up here. This is in my front yard. And here in fall 2017, we converted another 1,000 square foot lawn in our front to a 200 square foot pollinator garden along the edge of an 800 square foot meadow of native grasses. And there are 4 native grasses that are, I tried to have them be as local to where I live, but they're all local to Nevada County. California fescue, Idaho fescue, a tufted hairgrass, and the very tall grass here, so beautiful, is called June grass. And this is what the native meadow looked like 2 years later, when it was mature, before we did, weed whacking, once it was ready for weed whacking. So we've come to the end of our presentation with one final piece of advice that I originally got from Darlene, and that is that patience is required. And the first year they sleep, the second year they creep, and the third year they leap. This is really a good thought to keep in mind about native plants. It does pay off. We would like to encourage you to come next Saturday, same time, same station, to part 2 of our program, The Beauty and Power of Locally Native Plants. And now we're ready for questions. Lisa.
Thank you, Chrissy. Thank you, everyone. I will definitely be rewatching this when it's on our website as a recording. I learned so much, and I believe other people do as well. People are thanking me on the chat function. I do have a couple questions. I know we're running over for those who want to go listen to the radio show, but here's a couple good ones. One asks, how do we find out which plants are the least likely to be munched by deer?
That's a really good question. First of all, it really depends on where you live. Not that you can find out in advance, but different deer munch different plants. Wouldn't you agree, Darlene and Rita?
Definitely.
Yeah. So it's a plant that gets left alone in my yard might get munched at Darlene's or vice versa. So I would say don't trust anything. Carolyn Singer does have some books. Deer in My Garden. They're short, small little books. One is for shrubs, one is for perennials, one is for ground covers. And they're not overtly about native plants, but there are some native plants in there. So those might provide some guidelines. You certainly, if you plant the local plants that you see around in your area, and you include those in your landscape, you can know that those are less likely to be munched because there they are, the deer have left them. And I would protect plants when they're young, because when plants come from a nursery, all their growth is very tender and appealing. So when they're young, protect them. And then as they get to be older, they develop tougher leaves. What would you want to add, Darlene?
I would add that I went and looked at the CNPS, that's California Native Plant Society, Redbud website, which is on our handout. And I looked in the article called Compatible Plants Under and Around Oaks. And lo and behold, there's a lot of native plants listed, and there's a column on deer susceptibility. However, the list says mock orange has high susceptibility to deer. And I have to tell you, they have not touched mine at all. And I have several different ones.
Yeah, they don't touch mine either. So this is from your mileage may vary, but that is a good place to start. You know, I wouldn't trust any list to protect your plants.
Now, I don't know that I would believe every list I read. You just have to experiment.
And I think Cyanothis, for instance, I think the tougher the leaf, the less likely the deer are to bother it. Oh, the pricklier the leaf, the less likely the deer are to bother it.
Also, as a plant gets more mature, it can actually take a little bit of pruning if the deer nip the tender leaves near the tip. There's an article on Las Politas website, if it's still there. I haven't looked recently, but it amused me. It said if you want to prune, pretend you're a deer. Go around and just nip the little tender tips.
That's great. Really good suggestions. I can't wait for your next seminar. I know that your handout is excellent and has so many other resources on it, just like what you're talking about with deer. And I just had one final question for you too. The mistakes, some of the mistakes that you've learned from your own gardens, if you could share some of those, it finds after so many years, I find great information from master gardeners about that.
Well,
some of the mistakes.
Go ahead, Rita.
I think one of the biggest mistakes that we made with our landscaping when we moved up here, we didn't start small. We tried to do too much. We had not scoped out our environment properly. We did not at that point realize how limited our water supply was from our very pokey well. We should have just done a small portion, and that was the main thing. We also did not know enough at that point to group plants better based on their water and light requirements. And we should have been more disciplined about our plant selections in order to make better choices for the right plant in the right place. In particular, emphasizing native plants that would be happy in their natural environment. So those are some of the challenges that we've faced with. We're a little smarter now.
Well, I could add one thing. I tried very hard to plant everything right in the right spot, but I forgot to look at what it was going to be like when we tried to back out of our driveway. We ended up having to move a desert willow. And it didn't survive. I bought another one because I love it so. We moved 2 other plants that weren't native because, you really have to see what you're doing when you drive back out. It's still not perfect, so I go very slowly as I edge out. Another thing was that I did underestimate some of the mature sizes of plants. So they're kind of crowded close together. I keep hoping maybe the birds appreciate the added shelter. A third thing that isn't really a mistake, but it needs to be something mentioned, is that the sun and shade patterns may change through the years. plants grow up bigger, your neighbor's trees grow bigger. You may lose a pine tree or something. So you have to be willing to change, to accommodate whatever changes happen. How about Chrissy? Do you have any?
Oh, you know, the list is so long. I would say I did tend to say I'll buy one of that, 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 one of that. And so I didn't design so that I have, you know, patterns of, you know, 3 of this or a large mass of that. My garden has in many areas of where we planted, you know, a variety of plants, but not, you know, a well landscaped look. And it may also then perhaps cut down on the attractiveness to various pollinators, because the number of plants in any one species may be a little too, maybe too low to attract the pollinators to that particular species. I certainly have more than 10 species of plants, that's for sure. Another thing is that I put everything on drip because I do not walk around with a hose, and I found that it was just hard to keep up with when drippers stopped working. You know, I would inspect all the drip lines every spring and make sure everything was working, but sometime in the summer some things didn't work or they stopped working well, and some plants they were just too far away and I didn't notice them and they died. So I haven't quite solved that problem, but I'm trying to be better about it. And finally, this is just something that I'm starting to work with. I've been reading some things, some research that's been done out of University of Montana, University of North Dakota, about various kinds of mulch and the difference between fir bark mulch and wood chip mulch. And we brought in yard after yard after yard of fir bark mulch when we converted to thousands of square feet of lawn to natives. And we used fir bark for mulch. And I've learned that fir bark mulch sheds water, and because that's the role of bark on a tree, is to shed water. But wood chip mulch absorbs water because that's the role of the wood inside the tree. And so it makes the water more available to the plant that is below inside the chips, and the water flows through the chips better. So I have lots of wood chips, and I'm not quite sure how to solve that problem in a number of areas. So, problem for another day.